everyone, it's Lisa from My Dreaming Soap. Welcome to my channel. Now this may look a little bit different today. I've been asked a lot of times about making liquid soap, and I was just actually making, well, I've made about 8 batches today. This is my 9th batch today. So I thought, well, do you know what? Let's actually do a video on liquid soap making. Now I need to be a little bit careful with how I do this video because I use a technique, I think it's called like the 30-minute method liquid soap or something like that. It's not a technique that I created, and the people that did create it are obviously very sensitive about their technique and the copyright of it and everything like that. So although I'm going to go through the process, I'm not going to give out, you know, details of the ingredients in the recipe, but I'm just going to go through and show you how I do it and show you the basic process. It is a nice, easy method to do. Certainly it's something you need to be a little bit careful of the first time you do it, and maybe I would use one of the slower techniques of making liquid soap first if you haven't made liquid soap before. But I will of course leave a link in the description below of where you can find this course on this 30-minute liquid soap making, which will give you all the details and lots of advice on how you create your own recipe and all sort of stuff like that. There's a lot of information available in that course, and I'll leave it in the link below. So let's have a look. So here's my crock pot. Now with my crock pot, let's hope we don't steam you up. Mine is really nice and hot, and as you can see, or maybe not see, it's, let's say, dirty as such. The only reason it's dirty is because, as I said, this is like, I don't know, my 8th batch I've made today, and I don't fragrance or anything. I'm just literally making the base today, which I will fragrance and colour later. So one of the ingredients for making your liquid soap and to help it saponify and turn into liquid soap quickly is to have some already made soap to help with that reaction. So it's ideal that if you're making batch after batch after batch, if you just don't scrape out the pot too much and leave a little bit of the old soap in there that's already soap, then it saves you adding a bit of liquid soap because you've already got some in there. Okay, so that's why this looks a little bit dirty. Next thing I've got is all of my oils. I tend to find in this nice big crock pot, I don't know what size it is. I'll try and find out what size it is. I find, for me, 1,000 grams of oil is perfect in this crock pot. Bear in mind that you're going to need room in your crock pot to get all your ingredients in. Bear in mind this is a method of hot process soap making, so therefore your soap could volcano up a little bit. Mine doesn't tend to do that because of my recipe. But also as well, you need to be able to add the water in it at the end to turn it into a liquid soap. So therefore you don't want too much in here because you do need to have lots of space available. The other side, I guess, is you don't want it too shallow because then it's going to be very difficult to blend. Okay, so those are my oils, and everything needs to, key things with this method is things need to be hot. We've got additives that help the process go quickly, and also we need to obviously blend things. Right, so those are my oils in there and some of the previous liquid soap. First couple of additives going in are some sugar and some citric acid. And again, I'm not giving you quantities of these. Certainly you can go through and buy the course yourself or the book and have a look at the recipes and develop your own recipe. And there's all sorts of different choices of what sort of additives that you add in. And it gives you lots of information about what these additives do and why you should pick ones over the others, sort of thing. So it's a useful course to do. Next thing I've got is sodium lactate. Okay, now we want these oils to be nice and hot. Let's have a look what we've got. 199. I want them a little bit hotter. I want them about 215. This is degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm just going to give that a little stir. And then whilst I'm mixing up my lye solution, that can heat up a little bit more. So I'm going to put that to the side now. For a lye solution, we use a dual lye in this formula, and as you're probably expecting if you know anything about liquid soap, the main source of lye we're going to use is potassium hydroxide. Potassium hydroxide will create a liquid soap rather than a solid soap. If you're unsure about why and the difference between potassium and sodium hydroxide, I've done a whole video on it and I'll link it in the description below, which will then explain why you get a liquid soap with one and a solid soap with the other. We are going to add a little bit of sodium hydroxide in there, just a small amount. And we're putting that in there as potentially it's going to add a little bit of viscosity to your soap because the sodium hydroxide will bond together more. So it'll just help a little bit. You don't want to overdo it because you're going to end up with lumps of gloopiness in your soap. So just a careful balance between those. So there's our mixture of our two types of lye. Now obviously we need some water. Okay, so I've got my water here. Distilled water is pretty important for liquid soap if you want a nice clear liquid soap. If you use any water with any impurities, you're much more likely to get a cloudy liquid soap. And then I've got some vegetable glycerin. Now the idea with this is that you can add these to your lye solution. So you can add these two of them together for your lye solution, but I find the glycerin almost inhibits the lye from dissolving particularly well. So I tend to mix the lye with the water first and then add the glycerin after it's dissolved. So I'm just going to get my lye into my water. I'm just going to pop that back in that other jug to make sure I've got all those bits out. Potassium hydroxide always makes a good noise when it's dissolving, sort of hissing and almost a crunching noise. Right, okay, I'm happy with that. And that, because it's just the water, has got everything nicely dissolved. I need to be careful I'm not getting you all steamed up there. Okay, and once I'm happy that's all beautifully dissolved, it's at that point I will then add my glycerin in. You don't have to do it like this, but as I said, I found that when I've put them all in together, it's made the lye difficult to dissolve. Okay, that's that already. Okay, so those are my bits and pieces needed for my base soap. Okay, let's get my crock pot back. I know it looks a bit weird at the moment, that's that other older soap in there. I'm up to 196, 197, that's probably going to be okay. Ideally over 200 would be good, but I'm not going to hang around and wait anymore. So I'm just going to add this carefully into my liquid soap, or sorry, into my soaping oils. Now, the warmer it is, then the quicker it's going to be able to saponify and actually turn into soap. That's the idea of this 30-minute method. I must admit, I can get it done easily in 30 minutes, but not if I'm just doing one batch at a time, because to me things like the heating up the crock pot and the oils and that all does take a while. Do be careful though. Just over about 200 degrees, 210, 215 degrees Fahrenheit is a good temperature for this. Mine's a little bit cooler. Don't go too much higher. I have done it before and I've sort of been a little bit careless and I got my oils a bit higher than that. And that's the only time I've ever had it where my soap has actually volcanoed out of the crock pot. So keep an eye on those temperatures. Right, so now we've got those in there, we're just going to start blending that up. Okay, and again, just being careful to start with. We don't want this to splash on us. And every recipe recipe will be different. Some recipes will go through all sorts of stages. We'll go through like the applesauce stage, the mashed potato stage. Some of them will volcano up. Mine tends to go applesaucey. It doesn't tend to volcano. And mine actually doesn't take that long to saponify normally, but they're all slightly different. I know sometimes some people seem to be blending and blending and blending for ages. Okay, I've got quite a lot of bubbles in there. I don't like to burp my stick blender in my crock pot. But those bubbles won't be a problem, they'll all just go away. Okay, so as you can see, this is starting to thicken slightly and kind of getting a bit of a trace on it. Okay, can you see this stage? It's sort of now starting to go apple saucy. It's still a bit fluidy, but I just wanted to see if you could start to see the texture that's coming. Can you see that where we've got the soap actually starting to clump together, the oils and the lye clump together? And it's as it starts to get like this, you need to be careful. You might start to get some volcanoing coming up. Now, can you see with mine? Mine is now starting to look creamy. And this is a stage where you're wanting to get this nice creamy, thick stage. I do tend to keep going a little bit with mine. I don't know, maybe I blend mine a little bit too long, but it's never been a problem to me. I don't think you can really over blend it. Can you see mine starting to bubble up a little bit? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back off a minute. You could hand stir this with a whisk. I'm going to just let that settle a little bit because I don't want to agitate it whilst it's starting to rise and bubble, because that could be the time that you could force it too much and then you could have it coming over the top. So I am just going to leave that a little bit. Sometimes stirring it will help it go down a bit. Okay, I don't like mine to be quite this fluid. I've never been brave enough to leave it at this stage. I do like it to be a little bit further along, but can you see there? Well, let's do that again. Even at this point, can you see here? Here's some on my spatula. I'm just making sure I'm not steaming you all up. Can you see, look, how this is actually now, once we let it get a bit cooler, is actually turning into soap. Well, has turned into soap. So I am just going to give it, look, there we go, look at that. Okay, I'm just going to give it, because I'm a coward, I'm just going to give it one more little blend. As I said, I've never caused any damage to it by giving it one more blend. It's not like if you're trying to do a detailed swirl and you don't want to over swirl it. Okay, so I'm just going to go in. Can you see, look at those bubbles? That tells us it's now soapy. To me, I think the only disadvantage, it seems to me, for blending it a bit more is it then gets really quite thick and it just makes it a little bit more difficult to dilute. Now, if you're used to making liquid soap in the normal way, you end up with a really thick paste, which then can sometimes take quite a long time, even several days, to actually dilute properly. This one will be more fluid, even though, as you can see, it is, look, can you see that? Okay, soapy, soapy, soapy. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, just like you would do with potentially some hot processes, I'm just going to leave that a few minutes. Give it a little stir, leave it a few minutes. Give it a chance to make sure it's all cooked through nicely. And then we will come back and do a pH test on it before we dilute it, just to make sure. I mean, this looks soapy, doesn't it? But it is always good to check, especially obviously if we're going to be selling this, that we have got it saponified properly and there's no free lye floating around in there. Now, I know a lot of people say, oh, you can't do pH tests on soap. This is different. This is a liquid soap. We're going to do a pH test with a pH meter properly. You know, we're not testing a bar of soap after it's been made. This is an important stage for us to use when we're actually doing our liquid soap. Look, can you see how thick that's getting? Right, as I said, I'm going to stop faddling about with this and just leave that for a few minutes, and I'm going to get my pH meter ready. So I've had my soap just continuing to cook for a couple of minutes, and now before we dilute it, effectively finish the cooking, I'm just going to test the pH on it. And I always do mine with a pH meter to get a good accurate test. I use one of these Apera meters. And what we need to do is we need to dilute our liquid soap. Now, I'm not sure if every pH meter does it exactly the same. Obviously, when you get one, read the instructions on it and it will tell you at what rate to dilute your liquid soap or any cosmetic sap for you to get an accurate reading. It'll also tell you about temperatures as well. So often it will tell you what readings you should get at certain temperatures, like 20 degrees centigrade, that sort of thing. So I do try and make sure I stick within those parameters. So I'm just going to add the amount of liquid soap that I need. And as that's quite blobby, I am going to blend that up. And obviously I'm making sure everything is clean that I'm using, because I don't want to distort the result. Okay, I'm just going to pull some of that liquid off the bottom there, just to save us waiting. You only actually need a very small amount in the pH meter. There we go. That's fine. But overdid it there. Okay, so now I turn my pH meter on. And I have to just pop it into the liquid. And I can't really show you how this works because it needs to sit really still. You need to let it sit still, and certainly for this Apera pH meter, you need to let it sit still till you get a little smiley face symbol. And what we're looking at is we're looking for a pH in sort of like the 10 range, somewhere 10, 10.5. You know, don't really want it above 11. You're not going to get much below 10 or anything like that, just because of the nature of the pH of soap. Okay, so now I'm happy that this is in fact soap. And I think we can actually see that it's looking pretty soapy. It's quite thick, isn't it? What we need to do is dilute this down, and I think this is where it differs to quite a lot of other methods, is we can get it diluted pretty well straight away. I am just going to get my dilution water ready, and again that needs to be hot. So you don't want to put some cold water in here, so I'm just going to go and heat my dilution water, and I'll be back when I've heated that up. Right, so I've got my dilution water here, and I've just boiled it to just want it to just below boiling. So I'm going to start adding that into my soap, and it's just a case of just gradually getting this blended in. And so if you make liquid soap sort of the other method where it takes a bit longer, you might find you have to just let this absorb for quite a while, but here we can normally get it blended in quite quickly. Now, water dilution was probably the thing that I spent, apart from trying to develop my recipe and get one that was, my recipe's lovely, it doesn't dry out the skin, it lathers really beautifully. I'm really, really happy. It took me a while to get my recipe just how I liked it. But water was the other thing, was to get that balance where you put in enough water to make sure that you are fully diluting the soap. If you don't put in enough water, you end up with, you know, bits of soap still on the top, as it were. So it's getting that balance right. And once you know how much you use, then it's great. You can just pop it all in. And you do want to dilute your liquid soap a reasonable amount, because otherwise a lot of liquid soap is made with quite a high amount of coconut oil in it. And if you don't dilute it enough, then you can end up with quite a harsh soap that dries out the skin. And also as well, it ends up being really quite costly. On the other side of that, you don't want to dilute too much, because you don't want to water thin liquid soap. So it does take a while to get that balance right for what you need. I have my liquid soap at the point where I don't add any thickeners in it. I don't add anything to thicken it up, and that was one of the reasons why I chose some of the fragrances that I use, because some of them thicken a liquid soap and some of them will thin it out. So that was another thing that I spent quite a long time testing. Okay, so I'm happy that is all nicely blended in and there's no lumps of soap left. At the moment, it's all creamy still, and that's fine. What we're going to now do is just leave it on the heat. We don't want to boil over or anything, so just be careful that your heat isn't up too high. Mine just stays on high, and it always seems fine. Just going to leave that, and then what I'll do is I tend to leave mine for about half an hour, and then I'll come back and check it. And we'll be able to sort of wipe the foam away, and hopefully we'll see if it's clear. And once it's clear, then I just pour it off into another container, and then I start again. Right, half an hour, I will go and do some other things now, and then we'll come back and have a look to see if that's cleared up. Right, let's have a look at this soap. It's been about 20-25 minutes, and you can see now how lovely and clear that is. Let's move those bubbles out of the way. Those will all disappear, those bubbles. And you can see, I don't know how well you can see there, you can almost see right through to the bottom of the crock pot there. So that's now ready. What I'll do is I'm going to tip this out into another container and just leave it to cool down. And then off I go again and start another batch. So I'm going to leave that there for now. Once this is all cooled down, we'll then look at the next stages of preserving it and fragrancing it and colouring it. So this is one of my buckets. I make all my batches up and then I divide them into these buckets which are nice and sealable. So this is one of my buckets of my liquid soap. So it's basically got two of my individual batches in. So what I've done is I've let this cool right down, And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my preservative. Now you hear all sorts of different things about whether you should add a preservative to a liquid soap or not. Some people will say yes, definitely you should, because it's got a lot of water in. Other people will say, well, no, because of the high alkalinity, and most microbes won't grow above an 8.5 alkaline reading, but there are some that are more resistant. Other people will argue and say, but the water is actually bound to the soap, as it were, so there isn't actually any sort of free water kicking around. So there are quite a few arguments for why bother putting a preservative in. I take the view that, well, there is liquid in it, as in water in it, and microbes do need water to grow and survive. But to me, the main reason is I want to be completely 100% sure of this product. I know I can put things in sterile containers. I know I can take good manufacturing practices whilst I make the soap and all of that sort of stuff, but I can't really know what someone is going to do with it afterwards. So for me, if there is a chance that there could be a problem with any, microbes or anything, or any problem with the product, I'm going to do my best to stop that happening, because I don't know if what they're going to do with their liquid soap afterwards. I mean, bar soap is fine. Bar soap hasn't got enough water in it at all to be a problem. But liquid soap, they could get more water in it, they could dip their fingers in it, I don't know. They could keep it on their shelf for 5 years or something, but anyway, that's the reason why I do put a preservative in my soap. Preservatives, do be careful when you choose a preservative. Some of them won't work in a more alkaline environment, as it were, so do research your preservative if you're going to put one in your soap, just to make sure it is actually going to work. You don't want to pay money for a preservative and then find it only works up to a low level. Okay, so do make sure, and obviously each country, I think we get quite different ones here than maybe in the US, and they're all called sort of different names and things, so do just check out, and don't just buy a preservative without checking out sort of what range it's actually effective in, what temperature you can put it into your solution at, so just make sure you do some research with that. Right, so I'm going to go and preserve the rest of mine. It has clouded it up a little bit when I put that preservative in, but that will clear away again nicely and give me a nice clear soap. And I tend to just leave these for a while, probably these will probably be sort of a couple of weeks. I will leave these, and then I will colour and fragrance them, just timing for when I need my next batches done. Okay folks, we're back, and I nearly mucked up. I've actually been pouring and colouring and bottling up liquid soap for most of the day, and I've just literally got to my last batch and realised that I was supposed to be videoing it. So I've got one little bit of liquid soap left, so we can go for that. What I thought I'd talk about first of all is testing liquid soaps. I do think it's really important, especially if you're going to start selling liquid soaps, that you have a good product. So one of the things that I did was I tested a lot of fragrances. Now I've just got 3 little samples here. And what you'll find is when you use your fragrances in your liquid soap, there will be several things that will happen. So as you can see here, that some fragrances, just like they do with a normal cold process soap, will discolour your liquid soap. So I've just got a few fragrances here. These two look very similar, but as you can see, this one, this gingerbread colour, has actually discoloured. So just like any type of soap, you need to decide whether you want to work with that type of fragrance. And I do. This gingerbread is one of the fragrances I do as a liquid soap, because it means I don't add any colour and I get this gorgeous actual sort of gingerbready colour in my liquid soap. Other thing to bear in mind is if you're having a discolouring fragrance in a liquid soap, make sure it's fragranced, well in time before you sell it, because like a lot of discoloration, it will happen over a period of time. The other thing to bear in mind is obviously you may have some that don't discolour, which is great because then you can either choose to colour them or not. But the other thing that fragrances do is they may change the consistency of your soap. So some fragrances may thicken your soap up and some may thin them. So that was another thing that I wanted to consider, because the liquid soap that I make has a lovely consistency. I didn't mind if it got a little bit thicker, but I didn't really want it to get thinner. Now obviously if it does get thinner, you can add thickeners to it. I don't really want to do that just because I don't want to add another thing in and, you know, and then it mucks up with assessments and all of that sort of stuff that we have to deal with. But also as well, it adds an awful lot of cost to the cost of making your liquid soaps, and liquid soaps are expensive to make anyway. So to me, it was something that I didn't want to do. So that was, you know, a couple of things. What does it do to my soap consistency wise? I tested for that. So I put it in, see what it did, left it for a week or so and saw what the consistency was. You can normally see if it's going to thicken or thin pretty instantly when you put it in. What about the coloration? And then lastly was the scent retention. So again, I would make these up, and the third thing I would test them for would be scent retention. Bearing in mind again, you put in quite a lot of fragrance into a liquid soap based on, you know, the volume of the product. The volume of the product has a lot of water in, and so typically in the UK we can put up to sort of 3% in for a wash-off product. So therefore I could do that. But I ideally want a fragrance that's nice and strong and holds its scent, that I don't have to put too much fragrance in, because again, I want a product that I can sell at a good price that people will buy. I'm not going to be using a fragrance that I have to put a lot in to get a good fragrance out of. And so that was another thing that I tried. So I tested all my fragrances. I did them all at 2% first of all, picked out the ones that I thought were really great. There was one fragrance that I did choose that goes up to 3% just because I really wanted to use that, and that was my Sauvage, just because it's a really great fragrance, a good masculine fragrance. So that was great. I did use that one. But the others, I chose fragrances that I really liked, that gave me the characteristics, like discoloured when I wanted them to or didn't discolour, and those fragrances lasted well at the 2%. And it took me a lot of time to do the testing. I think sometimes we can rush in to making a product, but I tested, I mean, I've got about 50 or 60 of these little pots stored away. I did this, you know, several years ago. It's good for testing things like stability as well, because you can see these are actually a couple of years old. And this one certainly has still got a good scent to it, and there's nothing horrible. They've not deteriorated at all. So yes, it does take a lot of time testing. It's a little bit frustrating to search for the perfect things you want. I certainly spent a good 2 to 3 months testing different fragrance oils and waiting to see what the samples did and that sort of thing before I decided on what it was I wanted to turn into my liquid soaps. Okay, so that's just a little bit about testing. Right, so my last little bit of soap that I've got left, I've only got this little bit left to turn into actual fragrance soap. So this is just my base soap, and can you see how lovely and clear it is? Remember that liquid soap that we made? This, I don't know if you can see what that is. That's just actually bubbles where I've just poured it out of the canister that I've been storing it. So it's just bubbled up a bit. That's no problem. Those bubbles will actually disperse. It's not an issue at all, but it's a lovely clear golden liquid soap. And certainly for one of my liquid soaps that I make, my fresh ginger and green tea, I just leave it this colour because I think that's a perfect colour for sort of like fresh gingery sort of fragrance. So that's great. So what are we going to colour this with? I always use liquid, well, water dispersible dyes. Okay, I don't use any micas or anything because you do need to be careful. You want something that's going to disperse into the liquid soap, but it needs to be a very small particle because otherwise you'll just have them separating, and you'll have a wodge of, like, if you put mica in, it will just settle at the bottom of your soap, and you don't want that. You don't want bits of colour and bits of mica at the bottom of your soap and someone having to shake the soap before they use it or anything. Okay, so water dyes. Now you have to be really careful with these. You only use a tiny weeny little bit. So I've just measured off here, this last little bit I've got is 4 litres of soap I've got left to make up, so about 4,000 grams there. This is going to be my last little batch of English ivy that I'm making. So what I always do is I get some distilled water and I heat that distilled water up, and then I just take a tiny bit of, this is apple green dye. Okay, so just a tiny bit. Look, can you see how tiny, weeny small that amount is? I'm just knocking a bit of that off. And then, the thing with dyes, if you're working with dyes, they're weird. What often you get in the pot is not what you're going to get when they go into the water. So I've put my apple dye in there. Can you see how green that's gone instantly? I find it tricky to measure them, you know, because that amount is so small. It's like less than 0.1 of a gram. So I just do a tiny little bit there. My assessment allows me to have a little bit of flexibility in my colourants, so that's fine. And then what you need to be careful of is adding it into your soap. So I've got my liquid dye here. It's all nicely dissolved. That's why it's good. The hot water's good. And you don't want too much. You don't want too much water to your soap. The hot water helps it to dissolve well. And then just add tiny bits at a time until you get the colour you want. I like the colours of my liquid soap to show the colour, but I don't want them to be too dark. I almost want to be able to sort of see through them a little bit, and certainly that then helps my label to stand out. So I'll just literally add in a tiny bit of that at a time. Okay, so can you imagine how little colouring I've put in here? Remember that tiny little bit, and I've only used half of that so far. It's getting there to the green colour I want. I'm just going to add a tiny bit more. A tiny bit there. There, I like that. That's pretty good. So that's my nice apple green colour. And bear in mind, when you've got a big volume like this, it will look darker here, and when you put it into a smaller bottle where there's less of it, it'll look a bit lighter. Can you see? I don't know if you can see the difference there. Can you see how you can sort of still see through the green? Okay, so there's my colourant done. So that's that done. And then my fragrance oil, I've already measured that out. Good old English ivy from Nature's Gardens. I love this fragrance so much. I just love it. Okay, that can go in. Now what a fragrance will often do, so don't panic, is it will cloudy up. Is that a word? It will make your soap, can you see how that's gone cloudy? Don't panic. You will find, or you should find, that this will clear up as your soap sits. And again, this is another reason why it's typically important to get your soap made in plenty of time before you're going to be selling it. Now I've got no problem with bottling it like this, it's absolutely fine, and it will then just clear up and be beautiful and clear a little bit later on. I'm sure I'll put some pictures at the end showing you what the finished products actually look like. Yeah, so don't worry about this. And obviously if you've done your testing of your samples, you will know that, you know, with the fragrance oil in, what effect it will have on your soap overall, so don't worry. Also, bubbles. Now ideally we don't want a million bubbles, you don't want lots and lots of bubbles, but again, those will disperse and clear up, so don't panic too much about those. Okay, so making sure it's all really well stirred in, and we will get back to that lovely clear colouring. Now depending on, your soap will be clear or not clear depending on your recipe and what oils and everything that you've used. I like the idea of a nice clear, sort of crystal clear soap, although mine's coloured. Some people like the more sort of opaque, creamy looking soaps. So whatever floats your boat. Okay, so there's that done. Basically all I've got to now do, pop it into a bottle. Now I'm not going to do a load of bottling on the screen because I'm sure you can imagine what bottling looks like. So here we are with a final photo of the liquid soaps, and as you can see, the one in the top row on the left was that English ivy that we were just making. The one next to it is the gingerbread, the one with the discolouring fragrance oil, and the one at the bottom in the middle, the fresh ginger and green tea, is just the natural colour of the soaps. I know this was quite a long video, but I had quite a lot of things that I thought hopefully would be useful for you to see if you're thinking about making some liquid soaps. So I do hope you found the video useful. If you have, it'd be great if you gave me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see what I'm making in the future, why not subscribe to my channel? Thanks for watching, everyone. Happy soaping.